have been raining down on an entirely innocent population. A vast invasion is underway, by land, by sea, and by air. And this is not, in the infamous phrase, some faraway country of which we know little. We have Ukrainian friends in this country, neighbours, co-workers. Ukraine is a country that for decades has enjoyed freedom and democracy and the right to choose its own destiny. We and the world cannot allow that freedom just to be snuffed out. We cannot and will not just look away. It's because we've been so alarmed in recent months at Russian intimidation that the UK became one of the first countries in Europe to send defensive weaponry to help the Ukrainians. Other allies have now done the same, and we will do what more we can in the days ahead. Today, in concert with our allies, we will agree a massive package of economic sanctions designed in time to hobble the Russian economy. And to that end, we must also collectively cease the dependence on Russian oil and gas that for too long has given Putin his grip on Western politics. Our mission is clear. Diplomatically, politically, economically, and eventually militarily, this hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure. And so I say to the people of Russia, whose president has just authorized a tidal wave of violence against a fellow Slavic people, the parents of Russian soldiers who will lose their lives, I cannot believe this is being done in your name, or that you really want the pariah status it will bring to the Putin regime. And I say to the Ukrainians in this moment of agony, we are with you. We're praying for you and your families, and we are on your side. And if the months ahead are grim and the flame of freedom burns low, I know that it will blaze bright again in Ukraine, because for all his bombs and tanks and missiles, I don't believe that the Russian dictator will ever subdue the national feeling of the Ukrainians and their passionate belief that their country should be free. I say to the British people and all who have heard the threats from Putin against those who stand with Ukraine, we will of course do everything to keep our country safe. We're joined in our outrage by friends and allies around the world. We will work with them for however long it takes to ensure that the sovereignty and independence of Ukraine is restored. Because this act of wanton and reckless aggression is an attack not just on Ukraine, it's an attack on democracy and freedom in Eastern Europe and around the world. This crisis is about the right of a free, sovereign, independent European people to choose their own future. And that is a right that the UK will always defend.
Boris Johnson, the British Prime Minister, with a pre-recorded address to the nation about events in Ukraine today. Niamh Barker, following that one and listening along. He actually called him the Russian dictator, didn't he?
Yeah, he did. Absolutely not in any way pulling his punches, because the channels of diplomacy that have underpinned the drumbeat of war and the lead up to this invasion of Ukraine, those channels are now closed. We've gone from a country, the United Kingdom, that's in partnership with its NATO alliance members, in partnership with the EU and other like-minded democracies around the world, that had been trying to put pressure on Russia to deter it from doing exactly what it has done. But now, as Boris Johnson has implied, insinuated, a very different tact has to now be taken by these same Western democracies, more of a defensive tact. And as such, he said that we will do more in the coming days, that massive sanctions are on the way. one of the key takeaways, of course, particularly in the European Union and the UK, is that we must cease the dependency on Russian oil and gas. We're talking about a continent that relies on Russia for 40% of its natural gas supplies. That's higher in Germany. If people here in the UK think they're going to be insulated from what's unfolding in Ukraine, I think people are going to have to think again. Prices will go up. The British economy, other economies will be affected.
Thanks, Niamh. Niamh Barker, keeping an eye on developments from London. OK, pictures. Latest pictures I want to show you, dramatic ones, in fact. Let's roll this and have a look. A Russian attack helicopters near Kiev. I'm just checking if we've actually got the right pictures that I want here. You know what? I don't think we do. Various voices telling me that they may not be the right pictures. Andrew Simmons, can you hear me in Kiev?
I can indeed.
Yeah, go for it. Tell us about where you are and what's been happening.
Well, right now we're still taking shelter along with a number of other people by order of the district administration. There had been an alarm, there had been some strikes locally, and now it looks as if that alert is over. We'll be moving on from here, but I can just update you because we kept across developments. There has been an attack on Antonov airfield, which is 20 kilometers outside of Kiev, and there were helicopter gunships that flew into that airfield, striking with rockets and attacking at will. Quite an extraordinary scene when you think this is a European state with population of 44 million. Russia is attacking from air, land and sea. The people here are, well, they're beside themselves just here now. They're very silent at the moment, don't want to speak really, just feel so low, and trying to work out really what the next step is. So many people, so many families have actually gone off, got into their cars, chucked what belongings they can into the vehicles, and then joined really, really massive queues. Whole 4-lane auto routes are at a standstill. The children you see there, they're just playing, they're humouring themselves. That's one of few smiles you see around here right now, but also updating you on other parts, Kamal, other parts of the country. So much fighting going on, and so many armoured columns on the move. You saw Charles reporting there from the southeast, and furthermore, to the north, a situation whereby you have armoured columns of tanks seen crossing one border post, which is three borders in one, effectively, Belarus, Russia and Ukraine. And there you have a really, well, we visited the area in Senkivka only on Wednesday, and there were very weak defences there. There were some areas where the troops could actually get some cover, but this was overrun in seconds, and there are pictures of the tanks rolling through. We're hearing now that the Ukrainian military have somehow repelled that advance. But we can't confirm that. It is a surprising claim, because it would seem that's a strategic move by the forces from Belarus. Remember, a colossal force there, which was supposed to have been on some sort of military maneuvers for the past 2 weeks. 30,000 Russian troops up there with lots of armory, hundreds of tanks, hundreds of armored personnel carriers, missile launchers, and no doubt that those missile launchers are being used to attack parts of Kiev and surrounding areas. We are getting a vision really now of what is going on, that there are military targets to begin with right the way across the board, here in the capital and elsewhere too. In Kharkiv, some tragic scenes there, because reported it's reported that civilian areas have been hit and there have been deaths in those civilian areas. We're not sure of the situation in the capital. It does seem, I mean, the threat here was very high. There was a building just behind another building that was hit at a very harsh strike, and now it's something like it's nearly 9 hours since we were woken up by the crash of missiles going into buildings some considerable distance away. The orange-yellow flashes, and then the cacophony of sound, the sound of crumping missiles landing on targets, and then the wailing sirens, which came very late, it has to be said. And people just, well, their souls are so sad. People had looked to Russia thinking, no, surely not in this day and age, surely not this level of attack. And why? People I've spoken to here and elsewhere, and military and politicians, really angry with Putin, thinking Vladimir Putin making out that Ukraine had no right to exist, that it had no sovereignty, and the address that's 2 nights ago now, when he was making out that in Ukrainian history that Ukrainian had no real right to have a state and was really part of Russia. He talked in very glowing terms of the history, but then also he was perceived by people here, people who used to sort of look to Russia and think, well, okay, but we prefer a life in Europe, but, you know, okay, Putin is Putin. Not anymore. They think he's evil. That's the one terminology that's used, using his verbose narrative of history. And what they say is, 2 people told me only in the past 24 hours, a perverted view towards history, in that he believes that Ukraine is part of Russia, and that is that, and it has no right to be in NATO. He sees that as a threat. The people here, well, yes, they want to be in Europe. The issue of NATO is a complicated one. The leaders of Ukraine want to be in NATO, but where is NATO right now? And even if they had an application there, it would be sitting in the waiting room until there was no threat of conflict, because that is part of the NATO, that's the whole regulation of NATO when it takes on an application. But we are now in this position, and the president is, you've seen him talking, he's insisting that there is resolve here, that they will fight, and he said, quote unquote, we will win. That is ringing in a very strange way with people now. They're not sure. They are not sure at all.
Thank you. Tremendous reporting, Andrew Simmons, giving us a feel of what it was really like this morning as the missiles started arriving, fired in Kiev. Okay, pictures which I wanted to show you earlier. Got the right ones now. Let's have a roll and see.
Не видно українського герба, точно російські. Прямо над хатами. Прямо ось над хатами літають, падли. Полетіли в сторону аеропорта, бомблять аеропорт.
So you see the helicopters coming in there. I wanted to just wait until we saw that to explain Russian attack helicopters near Kiev from near a cargo air terminal. Apparently, Russian attack helicopters targeting the Hostomel airport. Not clear if there were casualties, but air bases, runways and the like have definitely been a target, a very obvious target in this first few hours of conflict in Ukraine. So just wanted to show you those pictures. And we want to bring in Richard Sakwa now, who we often talk to here on Al Jazeera, Professor of Russian and European Politics at the University of Kent. Thank you for your time today. I'm sure you're in demand for your views and information. So I don't know if you heard Andrew Simmons, our correspondent there, talking about what it was like this morning as it all started. And I've asked a lot of our guests this, what has surprised me is that the Russians chose to hit Kiev immediately. We all knew the eastern regions were going to be a focus, but it's been multi-pronged from all sides and going right after the heart of the capital.
Yeah, that is a surprise. I anticipated that they would push back the forces from the Donbass republics, which were recognized on the 21st, a few days ago. But this whole-scale attack from the south, the east, and the north was surprising. And of course, then the question becomes, what is the strategic purpose? It's not occupation. I think that in the first instance, it was to, Putin used the word Novorossiya, which was this sort of southern part, which maybe links up to Odessa, which opens up water access for the Crimea. But this whole-scale attack was unexpected, even though, of course, much anticipated.
So they've moved fast, moved from all angles, and moved with ferocity, really, as well. Some of these attack pictures that we've been seeing have been quite astonishing. What do you make of how, or to what degree the Ukrainians can fight back? Because NATO is talking about, yeah, we'll support you, but they're not exactly jumping in there.
Well, it's, they'll certainly fight back, and there's going to be an awful war. It's dreadful. But the question ultimately is why, and why did it happen now? And, there's so many factors. The immediate one, which is we've been talking about quite a lot, is the fact that over the last 6 or 7 years, the Minsk Accords weren't implemented. And don't forget that we're talking about this awful situation now for civilians in Ukraine. But don't forget that the 4 million citizens of the Donbass have been subjected for the last nearly 7 years to almost daily shelling, howitzer, and sniper attacks. 80% of the attacks came onto the Donbass population from Ukraine. One doesn't justify the other, and I'm certainly not suggesting that for a second. But I am saying it explains it. And why did the West not stop this? Why did the West was so upset, quite rightly so, about the siege of Sarajevo in 92 to 95, and yet a siege of 4 million? And it seemed also Ukrainian people, when they tended to denigrate their own citizens in the eastern part. So, of course, that doesn't justify anything. I'm simply saying that it's an appalling situation which has come to a head because Ukraine had said it will not implement Minsk. Plus, another issue is this nuclear weapons issue. In the last few weeks, Ukraine has been talking about becoming a nuclear power. And I didn't hear an adequate response from the West to say this would be unacceptable. And of course, Ukraine as a nuclear power next door, very hostile Ukraine, backed by the West, next door to Russia, would be a terrible strategic threat. Doesn't justify anything, and I'm certainly not justifying the response. But I am saying, look, if you are sitting in Moscow, or if you're sitting in London and Ireland was going to build Chinese bases and Chinese missiles heading to London, I don't think, the idea of a sovereign choice for Ireland to join Shanghai Cooperation Organization would be tolerated for 1 minute.
Yeah. So what is the issue? Why does it appear that the West, I'm just going to use that broad term, the West is scared of Vladimir Putin or is scared of taking real action? One of our earlier guests was saying, and to be fair, he's the Ukrainian ambassador to Qatar, but he was saying if the West had taken some serious action back in 2014 and put real sanctions in place, instead of just going after money trails and the like, then actually this sort of thing could have been avoided in the first place. There's something which holds countries back from taking real action against Russia.
That is a nonsensical argument. It's nonsense. There were quite severe sanctions. They could have, of course, they could always be worse. But sanctions do not actually shape policy. They're damaging, but they're ineffective as an instrument. The only way forwards would have been a normal diplomatic process. And, Western unity has held. But in my view, bloc unity leads to bloc discipline and bloc thinking. We needed more diversity. We needed different arguments. We needed to say, look, hang on there. A neutral Ukraine may not be such a bad thing. Russia, the last thing it needs and wanted was to launch into this action today. It's not Putin's evil plans. It's now the whole elite in Russia felt their back was to the wall. Again, not justifying the action, but it's simply saying that this idea, why has Western policy been made by a virulently anti-Russian government in Kiev since 2014? It's just absurd. We needed people like Macron. In 2019, he said, look, we need to listen to Russian security concerns. He didn't get anywhere, but it should have done. And so we should have been engaging far earlier. In December, Russia put forward some security ideas. You may not like them, but to dismiss them out of hand as absurd was absolutely crazy. It was, again, why should Western policy be made by a virulently anti-Russian government in Kiev? And this has led us to this catastrophic situation. And so we cannot get on a high horse and say, look, we're defending rule of law and so on. We are not. The whole post-Cold War agreement was about the indivisibility and unity of security, instead of which the West has simply said, okay, NATO is the option for Ukraine. It is so absurd that it's almost frightening, the fact that this is being repeated day in, day out, instead of saying, look, what are the concerns? Let's address them. Let's work them through a diplomatic process, instead of which it has come to this catastrophic position, which is only, and what is the West is doing is doubling down on the mistakes it made, which got us into this position in the first place, which will only intensify the war. There's no point sanctions. Why should you attack poor babushkas and so on in Russia? 144 million people. Why make them suffer for our failure to build a inclusive and acceptable security order in Europe? It was within our grasp, instead of which we went completely the wrong way.
So has the opportunity been missed? I take your point, what you were saying about the likes of Emmanuel Macron, who said, hey, let's actually listen to these concerns and try to work through them. Has that opportunity been missed now that we have tipped over into an invasion situation?
Sure, it's much, much harder now. You're absolutely right. It's much, much harder. But ultimately, we're going to have to end this we're in some sort of diplomatic format. So, let's do it sooner than later. This language of sanctions, it's what we've been doing for 30 years since the end of the Cold War. This sort of sense that we ended history and that we are the victors. We are not the victors. We need to constantly work with others and partners to try to achieve and listen to other concerns. It's very hard now to see how we can get back on a diplomatic track. But I do hope that it isn't just simply going to pile on more forces along the border. So for 30 years, we're going to have another Cold War with armed forces on either side. We just simply need to have more imaginative thinking. And we shouldn't take the line simply, yes, we want to see a sovereign, independent, free, democratic Ukraine, but neutral, and that's the only thing on the agenda now. A neutral Ukraine was quite normally, it was its position, by the way, until December 2014, before the anti-Russian forces took over in Ukraine. So this is not unusual, and the West has tried to play Ukraine against Russia, and this is the appalling result. Appalling. And so, I absolutely condemn the actions on all sides.
Richard Sacco, I appreciate your time today. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Let's look at NATO now. The Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg was speaking earlier and said the alliance wants to prevent conflict, but he also says NATO will defend itself if necessary.
NATO's core task is to protect and defend all allies. There must be no room for miscalculation or misunderstanding. An attack on one will be regarded as an attack on all. This is our collective security guarantee. Today, the North Atlantic Council decided to activate our defense plans at the request of our top military commander, General Todd Walters. This is a prudent and defensive step to protect and shield allied nations during this crisis. And it will enable us to deploy capabilities and forces, including the NATO response force, to where they are needed.
Dominic Kane in Berlin. Let's talk. I'll actually ask you about the German response in a moment as well, but let's talk about NATO, seeing as we just heard from Jens Stoltenberg. Was there anything new there, anything different there, or was it really the sort of same condemnation for Russia and support for Ukraine?
One thing to add to the idea of condemnation for Russia, support for Ukraine, also reassurance to the member states of NATO on the eastern flank of NATO, which from one perspective, if you're in Moscow, is the western flank, as it were, from their perspective, which is the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, but also to a certain extent Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania. They all have expressed concern, says Jens Stoltenberg, to him and to the North Atlantic Council about the events in Ukraine, and have sought clarifications from NATO about what NATO intends to do, which is why you heard him there, or we heard him in full earlier, spelling out exactly what NATO's intent was, which was prudent in his words, but also to reassure NATO member states by more troops being sent to those places, but also the Supreme Commander of NATO being given the authority, the autonomy, as it were, to demand more troops and then to allocate those troops to specific member states as he sees fit. General Todd Walters, we heard him being referred to by name by Jens Stoltenberg. But the one thing that stands out here is that at some point there will be a quiet little voice in the mindset of the NATO leaders, the NATO prime ministers, presidents, and that sort of thing, which is at what point are they prepared to say, OK, no more? And at what point are they worried about the prospect of what they do being perceived adversely in the Kremlin, and that adding and fueling the flames of what's going on right now? So they're having to play a careful game, as it were. Reassure NATO member states, support Ukraine, condemn Russia, but try to do it in a way that is not escalatory, which clearly is very difficult given the scenes we've been seeing.
And the German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, speaking a little bit earlier, I mean, he was heavily involved, what was it, last week? I'm losing track of time now, where he went and visited both presidents. What's he had to say?
Yeah, well, Mr. Scholz has been particularly active. There were some people a few weeks ago who were saying, where is he? What's he been up to? Well, now they know what he's been up to. He has been talking to President Putin, talking to President Zelensky, but also talking to President Macron, President Biden, Prime Minister Johnson and others, trying to work out what a multilateral approach in terms of sanctions would be. We know that he has already said no to Nord Stream 2. That's been switched off. Today he said, look, Putin has the war he wanted. This is Putin's war. Putin is going to pay a price. The sanctions are going to be particularly severe and they're going to hurt a great deal. We'll hear more about that in the course of the day. Remember also, he's going to be very active today anyway. We know that Germany is going to be staging the G7 summit later this year in June in Bavaria. Today, there's going to be a virtual meeting of G7 leaders, and that takes in Prime Minister Johnson, President Macron, President Biden, Olaf Scholz, the Prime Minister of Japan, the Prime Minister of Italy, the Prime Minister of Canada, plus representation from the EU. So they're all going to be expressing their concerns, and we know they all share substantially the same view about what Russia is doing. And then we know that there's going to be a virtual summit of NATO leaders tomorrow, where again Mr. Scholz will have the opportunity to express his opinion. And finally, we know that this evening there's going to be that special summit, extraordinary summit in Brussels, an EU summit, again, where Mr. Scholz will be meeting up with very many fellow leaders, heads of government or heads of state, all of whom share the same view. The key question here is the Germans don't want to be seen to having troops or sending weapons to Ukraine. What shape will those really severe multilateral sanctions take? We'll find out potentially later today.
Thanks, Dominic. Dominic came with the perspectives from across Europe for us. It's half past the hour, 12:30 GMT. I'm Kamal Santamaria with continuing coverage on Al Jazeera of Russia's military incursion into Ukraine. It's about, well, coming on for 10 hours since that announcement was made by President Putin, and a lot has happened since then. We've got correspondents right across the story. We've got a report for you right now from one of them, Andrew Simmons in Kiev.
The months-long build-up of Russian troops on the border with Ukraine has turned now into an invasion. Ukraine under attack. Military bases, airports and aircraft have been targeted and bombed. The skies over multiple cities, including the capital Kiev, lit up, waking up residents in the early hours of Thursday as Russian artillery advanced.
Not very many could have predicted that he would be striking at so many multiple targets.
The civilian casualties are unknown, though Russia says it will only attack military posts. As a response, Ukraine has declared martial law.
I had a conversation with US President Joe Biden. The US is starting to gather international support. Today we need you, each of you, to be calm. If possible, stay at home, please. We are working. The army is working. The entire security and defense sector of Ukraine is working.
These attacks come after Russian President Vladimir Putin declared 2 separatist areas in the Donbass region in eastern Ukraine as independent and said Russian civilians who live there need protection. The battle for Luhansk and Donetsk in eastern Ukraine has been going on since 2014, with more than 14,000 people killed in fighting between Russian-backed separatists and the Ukrainian army. Now Putin has demanded Ukrainian forces retreat.
Whoever would try to stop us and further create threats to our country, to our people, should know that Russia's response will be immediate and lead you to such consequences that you have never faced in your history. We are ready for any outcome.
The operation began despite last-ditch appeals from members of the UN Security Council to ease tension. Ukraine's ambassador to the UN demanded his Russian counterpart step down as chairman.
Call Putin, call Lavrov to stop aggression. There is no purgatory for war criminals. They go straight to hell, Ambassador.
In a statement, US President Joe Biden warned of a catastrophic loss of life and human suffering. There's a mood of desperation developing now. Many people just jumping into their cars, getting their families together and heading on the road, trying to get to Poland. But the main auto routes are all jammed. There are so many people trying to do the same thing. Others are going underground, taking shelter. The missiles are getting closer now. Emergency meetings have been called to reach an agreement, while the shelling and build-up of military troops on both sides continues. This is Ukraine's darkest day. Andrew Simmons, Al Jazeera, Kiev.
So Andrew Simmons with that report. He's been reporting variously from actually what looked like an underground car park at one point. They sort of took some cover there. But before that, he was up in his live position and there was an explosion not far behind him. We've got the aftermath of that just to show you. We're going to run the pictures and talk through them. So there you see it. In the background, fire has come up in the background. And when we get into the closer shot, it should come in a moment, you'll see what appears to be people throwing documents, bags of documents even, onto that fire. Now, the Russians have said they're hitting military targets in Kiev. The Ukrainian ambassador to Qatar, who was with us earlier in the studio, said there are no military targets in the centre of Kiev. We believe this may have actually been an intelligence target. That's unconfirmed, but, well, when you see people burning documents, it does raise a few questions. So that was just something I wanted to show you earlier. You may have seen when Andrew Simmons was reporting and there was an explosion over his shoulder. That was the aftermath of some of it.